Okay, good afternoon everyone. I'm very pleased to introduce Geoff Wilkinson to you. Geoff is the MD of Wilkinson Construction Consultants, who amongst other things provide an approved inspector service, and he's going to talk to us today about building regulations in general, but with a specific focus on the role of the approved inspector. Geoff's got a very long and varied career in building control. He's widely in demand to speak at various events, and he writes in various publications on building control. So we're very privileged to have him with us today for what I hope will be a really interesting discussion.
Thank you very much. Yeah, okay. So, thank you very much for having me along today. I'm sure you'll agree that this is probably the highlight of your course. Yes, an hour's worth of discussion on building regulations. And not even the nice technical stuff either, but the highfalutin process. Oh, how enjoyable this will be for you. Well, as you've heard, I'm Geoff Wilkinson. I'm Managing Director of Wilkinson Construction Consultants. I've been in building control now for in excess of 30 years. In fact, about 30 years ago, I was working for Westminster District Surveyors in this very building, or technically the little annex building that's in Luxborough Street, around the corner, which is where we were based. As you'll see from the screen in front of you, I have done various TV appearances. I regularly write in Architects Journal. If anyone's got this month or this week's building magazine, you'll find a supplement in there, and you'll find one of my articles in there as well. So we're on the topic of building regulations, and in particular how you can go about getting approval. Now, we're going to focus predominantly on the two key routes, which are local authority approval or the use of approved inspectors. It's perhaps worth me pointing out that that's not the only methods by which you can obtain building control approval. And for example, on smaller scale projects, you actually have competent persons and self-certification schemes. For example, you're probably aware that if you have any electrical work done on your home, you'll need to get a Part P electrician to do that, and they will self-certify that particular work. So we're instead focusing, as I say, on the two types of building control service. This particular slide is taken from DCLG's own guide to building control services, and they actually show building control as being two little Hitlers, which I think you'll see is a little on the stereotypical side of it, small guys with little moustaches. We are not that in any way, shape or form. Historically, building control was seen as an area where you had people who were working against you. They were there to provide a stop to what you were doing. One of the things that changed in the 1980s was that we moved away from having a prescriptive system into a functional system. Does anyone in the room know the difference between prescriptive and functional requirements? No. Okay, this is going to be a long afternoon, isn't it? Right. A prescriptive system basically tells you this is how you're going to do it. So it says, for example, I'll take you all the way back to the Great Fire of London in 1666. In those days, we turned around and the very first set of building regulations said, you shall not build out of timber and straw. And that's how the regulations were cast from that day forward. All the way through till about 1985, at which point we changed to a functional system. At that point, the regulations are now worded along the following lines: the building will not burn down. You can see the difference between the two. One is telling you what it is that you have to do, and the other one is telling you how to achieve it. Okay? So there are two different ways of doing it. Now, the two types of building control service, the local authority route and the approved inspector route, both work within that same framework. The actual regulations themselves, the things that you need to comply with, are no different depending on which route you actually go. So what are the actual differences? Well, I'll start with the local authority routes to compliance. They give you effectively three ways to obtain an approval. There's the full plans approval route, there's a building notice approval route, and there's something called a regularisation approval. Local authorities don't just do the approvals though, they also do other work. They focus on the enforcement side of the stuff. So if you haven't got a building control approval and you start work, they would actually have responsibility for checking on that and in making the enforcement. They would also deal with things, for example, like dangerous structures. So they have a wider remit than an approved inspector does. I'll deal first with the full plans route. Now, this is the main way in which you obtain building control approval if you use a local authority. The way the legislation is written, they must give you a decision within 5 to 8 weeks. Okay, so there's a set period of time during which they will deal with it. They have effectively a choice of 3 decisions that they can make during that time. They can either reject your application, they can conditionally approve your application, or they can give an approval for it. And I would advise that if you start the work without approval, that work is at risk. Now, what information do you need to provide if you're going to go down that full plans route? You need to provide scale drawings, you probably need to provide site investigations, you need to provide specifications, calculations, structural information, drainage information, rainwater design, energy assessments, fire strategy and access statements. So there's an absolute mass of information that you've got to collate and present and get that checked and approved within a 5 to 8 week period of time. Just to give you some idea of the kind of level of detail that we're looking at, you can see from the screen, even on a basic domestic building, there's a lot of information that you would actually have to put together and submit to us. Secondly, there's something called the building notice route. Now that really is only intended for domestic properties. Under that system, there are no detailed plans required, although the council has the right to ask for drawings or calculations, but there is no specific requirement for you to have submitted them. Literally all you need to do is submit a location plan for that extension and you can start almost immediately on site. There is no approval of your application under that system. All that happens is that you get a completion certificate at the end of the work to say that the works comply. Actually, there's quite an interesting point around that. I'll pick that up on at the moment. So we've gone down the full plans route and you've submitted the information, you've got an approval. Do you have to build to the plans that you have submitted and had approved?
Yes. Yes. No.
Under a full plans application?
You do, but you have to do something.
Okay. Very interesting point. The answer to that is actually no. There is no requirement that you actually build what is on your building control approved set of plans. The requirement is simply that the works on site comply with the building regulations. So during the course of the project, you can actually make a whole series of variations, changes to materials, all sorts of things. And so long as those changes themselves comply, that's perfectly okay. If you submit a full plans application to building control and you have it rejected, can you start work on site?
Yes.
Correct. Because even though you've had a rejection, you can still start because by the same token, you've made an application, okay? And so long as the works themselves comply, you can continue to work on site because there is no requirement that you actually build to the approved plan, which is bizarre, but it is true. The third type of approval is something called a regularisation or retrospective approval. Now, this can only be done through the local authority, and it's for works that are undertaken since these regs changed in 1985. You are not under any obligation to make a retrospective application, and the council doesn't have to accept that application. What it means is that if you have previously carried out work, suddenly realise that you don't have approval for it, which is quite common in the domestic end of the market, you can actually go back and get a retrospective approval. But the probability is that you will end up having to expose some of that work and you may well have to do remedial works to it. You're also likely to still have to submit plans and calculations, etc., to justify the work that you've had carried out. We would never advise that you attempt to go through the process and not have the approval. Okay, at the very best, this usually ends up happening when someone comes to sell their property. They do a search of the history of the scheme, and they discover that there is no approval in place. It's incredibly disruptive, and it's almost certain to lose you your sale. So if anyone is ever in the position where they're selling a property, before you get to that stage, check whether you have the approvals in place for any work that you've carried out. Remember, it can be something as simple as replacement windows, petitioning, taking doors out. All of these things could potentially require building control approval.